Hi everyone. Let's talk about the quality manual. This is the most basic and core document of your QMS. If you're just setting up your QMS, this is what you should start with. And in one aspect, also what you will end your work with. Before we dive into our template though, let's take a brief look into why we're doing this. As I just said, this is a very basic document. So you will also find the related requirements also at the very beginning of the ISO 13485 norm. So amongst other things, you'll have to document which laws and standards apply, what role your organization will be undertaking. So for example, manufacturer or just distributor, and also which processes you will need to carry out that role. All of this stuff should be mentioned, either described or at least referenced in your quality manual. Going forward, we will then see that in paragraph 4.2.1 and 4.2.2, a quality manual is explicitly required for that purpose. And in the case of our template, we also cramped the quality policy of paragraph 5.3 and the quality objectives into our template for the quality manual. So when you get tired of working with our template, asking yourself, do I really need to do all of this? Then yes, sorry to say, we didn't come up with it. This is explicitly part of the norm, and our template really only is intended for minimal compliance. Now let's dive into our template, and we'll look directly at an example of how it could be filled out. Just like in the norm, you will first start by describing your role. And typically, let's assume that you're a manufacturer of medical devices. We then define the scope of applicable laws and standards. And first disclaimer here, this is a selection of a few norms only, and you will need to customize this probably. The norms that are cited here are the core standards that apply for software medical devices. And there's a whole range and number of other applicable norms, such as 15223 for medical device labeling, or the ISO 27000 series for IT security, I think, in case you need to comply with that. So that list may grow long. So what I've often seen here is that companies only put down a core selection in the quality manual, and they then reference to a separate and more comprehensive list of applicable regulations as a separate document. Moving on, you will also need to specify what parts of those norms you can exclude as not applicable for your QMS. So those are typical examples here. For contamination control, cleanliness of the product, all of these things typically don't apply for software medical devices, obviously. Next comes a first section you will actually need to get a little bit creative on. You need to define a quality policy for your company. If you have any person with a business MBA in your company, I recommend that you hand your draft file over to them. Alternatively, this is a classic CEO task. So you talk about your mission and vision for your company, the industry field you're in, and how your company wants to advance it. You can break that down to 1 or 2 short paragraphs at minimum, or at maximum half of a page if you're really into it, I would say. Obviously, you should make sure that it has some sort of relation to quality work, so leave out stuff like profit margins, shareholder value, or things like that. Amongst other things, your ISO 13485 requirements, which you can find here, are that the quality policy is applicable to the purpose of your organization. It's committed to compliance with regulatory requirements and to maintain the effectiveness of your QMS, and so on and so forth. So if you want to read up on it, this section 5.3 gives you an indication of what you could write and what you should take as a point of reference when you write the quality policy. What's important next is that you now have to show that this quality policy you just wrote translates into measurable quality objectives. And one way you can approach this is that you first think of 3 or 4 bullet points. These are some examples here that I often saw in my consulting work. And then you add a couple more sentences to describe those bullet points in more detail. Again, your 13485 requirement here is that those objectives must be measurable and consistent with your quality policy. So they should be covering both regulatory requirements and requirements for your product. Let's say general regulatory requirements are compliance with norms and standards. Product-related ones might be accessibility, that you want to make it your product available for as many patients or users as possible. So those are just some examples to think of. Finally, in a third and last step, auditors might ask you, how do you keep track of a quality objective to see if it was achieved or not? And the answer is key performance indicators, or KPIs. Now, as part of your management review, you will anyways have to review all your QMS processes plus your quality policy and objectives at least annually. That's why in our templates, we suggest that you meet both requirements at the same time by defining KPIs for each QMS process. You can then argue that by achieving your KPIs, you make sure that your processes run well, which also meets, in turn, your quality objectives. For that purpose, you should only double-check that each quality objective translates into at minimum one process KPI. And where there's no corresponding process for quality objectives, you can define additional KPIs that are not process-related. If I was too fast, and if you have more questions on how to handle KPIs, you can watch the video on management reviews, which covers the topic in a bit more detail. Finally, on a brief note on how to document this, you can define KPIs either in every single SOP separately, or in a separate central overview sheet, like we've done here, and which you can then reference at this point. In a nutshell, think of all of this as a waterfall kind of approach. You first write a very abstract MBA-style quality policy, which you then specify further out in quality objectives, which are already measurable. And you then make this most specific as part of your KPIs. In past companies that I've worked with, this approach always earned me at least some brownie points with auditors, but also management often like to use these KPIs here in the end to track something at least somewhat useful. Next up is roles. To answer a typical question that I get a lot here, no, you don't have to write down all the roles that you have in your organization or that you will potentially have at your company. Only write down the roles that are relevant to your QMS. And in our template, you will find the minimum roles which we will need to define. First, that is management, the quality management officer, and the person responsible for regulatory compliance, or PRRC. The minimum by which you need to describe those roles is, first, what tasks and responsibilities does this person have? So for the CEO, that person needs to represent the company. And second, what minimum qualification is needed for this role? So basically, for minimum qualifications, you can come up with the kind of stuff that you would find in a job posting on LinkedIn. And as your company grows, you will have to add more roles to this list, obviously. So just as a last note on how to solve that in the future, large companies typically outsource this documentation then to separate job description sheets, which you can instead reference here. In the last section of our template, we will look at your QMS processes. In the last section of our template, we will look at your QMS processes. Here, you should list up all the processes that your QMS is going to have. So this is the part I said you will need to get back to after all your QMS work is done. Still, two last remarks on this for now. First, notice the process categories. Those are more or less arbitrary, but they do have some function. They will help you, for example, to classify certain processes as more risky than others. And that will be relevant once we get into internal auditing, for example, where you will audit those processes then more often than others. And a last remark, again, on your hopefully bright and successful future. Once your company grows to hundreds of people and a more complex set of QMS processes, it often makes sense that at that point you add or reference here an overview flow chart that shows how certain SOPs are related and interact with each other. For now, I hope that you didn't fall asleep yet and that you're ready to get started with your first QMS document.